And one of the questions I always ask is like, what is your main motivation that brought you to develop Leaders Empowered?
Well, I have a background in psychology and in conflict resolution. And what that should mean, and in my case what that does mean, is that I really like human beings. And I would like us as human beings to have a good time together and to get along well with one another. So I was always interested in working with human beings, and since most of us spend a lot of their lifetime in organizations, that was a specifically interesting area for me to look at the organizational context and the context of leadership, and where hierarchies may be present or may not be present, more or less. But just that context was specifically interesting for me, to develop something that helps to shed light on what happens inside and between human beings in the context of an organization and of leadership.
And what are the pillars of this program? What is the main foundations of this program?
Where we start off actually is we are really interested in finding out more about who is the person, who is the human being. If I would be working with you through the program, my first interest would be, who is Judit? Who is she as a person? What is unique about her? What is special about her? What is stable about you in that way also? So that is something, that's where we start the journey, which is something that is a bit different, I would say, from other approaches maybe, because we start right at who are you as a person? Which is quite a big question actually, but we find it important to start there because people are stable to a certain degree. There's not so much you can change about a person or a personality. So it's good to know who you're dealing with, or who people are, you know. Right. So we encourage we do a lot of self-reflection in the beginning. And we are especially curious about what are the areas where you become really alive. Where's your curiosity? What sparks your creativity? So those areas are very interesting to identify, because that's where our unique contributions and our talents are coming from also. Yeah. The second thing that is interesting is, of course, the role that you have within the organization. The role or the roles that you have. So what are those roles? What is this role that you have? And how can you also there raise awareness? That's again a lot of reflection on where your role begins and where your role ends. And so that is the next step that we take, and this is something that is very important. And to also understand that you as a whole person and the specific role that you have or the roles you have are not the same thing. I mean, they should be related, and you bring something unique into your role, but you're also in roles that have a beginning and an end. There's boundaries to these roles too. And so we start differentiating the person and the role, and at the same time looking at how can you be authentically in your roles. That's the next step. We work with people on how to make transparent and how to communicate actively about which role they're speaking from and how they define that role, what their ideas and their visions are in that role. Especially if you have a leadership role, we encourage leaders to really work on their personal vision for what they want to do as a leader, and to make that transparent again and again, and to translate that into a behavior that you would like to see with the people you're working with. So we call that whole process, we call that positioning yourself.
So what would be the other pillar, Lukas, that you have built?
Well, the next big topic is conflict.
Oh, that's the word, huh?
It happens all the time, it happens everywhere. But conflict is a wonderful thing. Yeah. That's a provocative thing to say, because most of us for good reasons also, are shy about conflict. And the reason why we're shy about conflict, or we don't like it too much, is because a lot of us have experienced hurt or trauma around conflict. And the reason for that, again, is because it was on the person. You took it very personally. We talked about that before with the role. Right. So we tend to think, okay, conflict, I have a conflict with you, so we tend to think, okay, you hurt my feelings, I hurt your feelings, and now I'm being mean to you and you being mean to me again. So we need to de-escalate that. We need to go back in time and see, how did you hurt me? How did I hurt you? What are my needs? What are your needs? How can we make peace? How can we find compromise? That is all personal stuff. It's all on the people and on their personal feelings. Now, that is only one perspective on conflict, and what we introduce in this manual is a field perspective on conflict, which is a much more systemic view, where we are actually interested in the whole field of an organization, and whatever the conflicts are that appear between the individuals in the organization, we are interested in looking at that as simply information that is pushing to the surface of the organization's awareness. So from that perspective, conflict is no longer something that happens between two people. It is something that happens in a field, and the reason for the conflict is the field itself. So the field becomes the host of the conflict.
So you mean that in a field there's always polarities, let's say, yes, or always opposites, in a way.
Absolutely, there's always, I mean, hopefully so. I think if there's no polarities anymore, if the field is dead, sort of. There's not much going on anymore. If things are too harmonic or too flat or too quiet, that is not the best state to be in for an organization that would like to evolve or develop itself. So any tension that's in the field is actually highly interesting. And we can have so much of an easier time with it if we come from that perspective. Right. If we have an attitude that welcomes conflict and differences as an expression of diverse opinions and polarities in the field, we can pick it up and we can work on it as a group. But we need skills, and that's what we introduce in this field perspective. And the skills we need to understand that these are roles that are conflicting and not so much people. And we need to learn how to switch roles. And the role switching, that is like the royal road to working with conflict, to get to the creative potential of conflict. Because conflict tends to self-organize, and that's a bit of a new thought, maybe, to many people, but that's where we're going in this manual, and that's where a field perspective is going. And especially if we talk about self-organizing team and flattening hierarchies and all these things, you cannot do that without a field perspective on conflict. If you keep taking things personal, you're removing a whole structure of how conflict is managed, and you do not replace it with anything, and things will not go too well if you don't introduce the field perspective. You have to change an organizational culture, and that includes the attitude to conflict and how we work on it, and that's practice, practice, practice. And in this manual, we have a lot of practical exercises where people just practice that, like in a dojo where you learn, how to do karate, the martial arts. You have to practice this,
And then I think you have also the rank and power thing. That's very so present in organizations, and especially when we're speaking of hierarchical organizations and when we're speaking about less hierarchical, power and rank exist all the time.
Yeah. We use the term rank to describe differences in power in relationship between people. And we talk about two kinds of rank, and the one kind of rank is rank that is linked to your hierarchical position.
The one is in your name tag, let's say.
Yes,
like director, manager.
Exactly.
Position.
Yeah, that would be a positional rank. A positional rank, although, could also be something. A positional rank could also be something that is connected to your social rank. Like I have a certain number of privileges that come with being a man, for instance, and that is a social rank. And those are all, we call those positional ranks, meaning that they position you somewhere in the society or in an organization. Mm-hmm. And they are outer ranks. They're not so much coming from the inside, but they're in the context of society or an organization. So they're more outer ranks. And then we all have personal ranks, personal powers.
Right.
And those are more inside powers. We talk about spiritual and psychological rank, where we say, to what degree am I able to cope with challenges? How fast do I recover? How resilient am I? How much do I feel I am grounded in myself? I can create a home for myself. And now the interesting thing is to look at how does the relationship look like between your outer powers and your inner powers? Is there more or less a balance? Like if I am high up in a hierarchy, do I also feel powerful on the inside?
Right.
Like outside of that context or not?
Right.
And if I don't, which can easily be the case, if I focus on this only, it's very possible that here I actually don't feel that powerful on the inside. And if that is out of balance, that becomes a bit complicated. So I will then probably not make the best use of my positional power because I need it to feel powerful on the inside. A lot of this program is about transparency and understanding what are the dynamics in the background.
Right.
That would then also be the next chapter where we look at communication signals other than the verbal content of what we're saying. So here we are interested in how can you tell that somebody, for instance, right now feels overpowered by the other person or intimidated,
Right.
What kind of communication signals show you that somebody feels overpowered or powerless at the moment? What kind of communication signals show you that somebody actually is connected to, feels empowered from the inside? Mm-hmm. So that translates into a lot of nonverbal stuff.
Right.
And if we don't have awareness around it, again, it's confusing. I want to have a conversation with you. For some reason, you're looking down all the time. You're sitting like this, and you have a hard time for formulating yourself. You get stuck looking for words, and I'm like, what's the matter with her?
I don't trust you.
Just trying to have a conversation with you. So there, to understand more about rank would help me to understand, okay, she must feel intimidated right now by something I'm probably not aware of enough. So we look into these things. And again, that's a very important topic in my mind in the context of flattening hierarchies, agility, self-organization, because what we do there is we're removing a structure that defines power and says this is where the power is, and if we remove that, we need to reconceptualize the topic, right, so that the power can still be used well, because if we just remove the structure, it's going to run wild, right. So we have to replace it with awareness on what's happening.
So after rank, where do you take this next?
After rank, and having studied some of the signals also about how high rank and low rank experiences actually show up in the moment to moment communication, we focus a little more on what happens in communication in the moment. We're interested in nonverbal communication signals, and how those can tell us another story than what happens on the content level. And that is something that is widely known. This is no news, and everybody who's studied communication psychology, we know about that. But still, it's interesting how much emphasis we still have on the content, knowing that content is not as important as we think it is when we're communicating. So all the nonverbal signals that are happening are much more important. And there, what we're specifically interested in the manual is to train people in following the content, but also following the communication signals that go with the content, and to learn to differentiate between what are communication signals that go along with what I say and what are communication signals that go against what I say. And that also explains a lot of confusion on the one hand that we sometimes experience because we don't really understand what's happening anymore if those signals are not in agreement or in alignment. And it's also the reason why a lot of stuff that we agree on and we thought we had a contract or we thought we had an agreement, but actually it doesn't work out. So whenever something doesn't work out or hasn't worked out that you thought you had agreed on, you can always rewind and wonder, what did I miss in the moment-to-moment communication? So a lot of focus on here and now. What happens in the communication in the moment and how can we follow that?
We get trained on how to read further than the content.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah. And how to have also how to have a pragmatic approach to dealing with people. That's what we're focusing on. What happens inside the people and what happens between the people. So we often have a tendency to over-focus on the input. Like the content, what we want to get across, and we focus on that input, but we don't study the output. We don't study what comes back.
Right, the feedback.
The feedback, exactly. And we lose a lot of energy, and we could solve a lot of communication problems if we'd have more of an output orientation and if we would be more pragmatic. We call that the pragmatic input-output analysis. You know, what is my input and what comes back?
So after the communication part, there is a part that's really interesting and it's always catching my attention is how to deal, it's the part that you specify here, and how to deal with the disturbance.
Yeah.
You know, how to deal with something that makes you really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And it's good that we have a methodology here that tells us how to do it.
And we talk about a guest house as a symbol or as a metaphor, and about how that guest house can be either open or closed. And the degree to which the inner state of the guest house determines the outer situation and the outcome of the outer situation is very high. Mm-hmm. It's a bit like the flip side of the content thing, where we say content is not that important, but inner attitudes are very important. And it really depends on the way I approach something. This will be we do two things. The one is we work on and we have exercises and steps on how can I open my inner guest house again. So how can I notice that my guest house is closed down? How can I bring to my awareness that once the guest house is closed, it's going to be really hard to do to proceed in a constructive and creative way, and how can I open my guest house again? So this is what we would call the inner skills of the program, inner work, working on yourself and your attitudes. So we're doing a lot of working on your own perception and your own inner experiential world in that section of the manual. And so how to open the guest house again, and then what you said, how am I going to relate to something that is outside of my identity, let's put it like that, and it is disturbing me. And in that sense, it is also something that we need to work on individually, on being irritated. And what irritates us is actually a wonderful topic, because it holds a lot of potential information. We can gain something out of that, believe it or not. Like the stuff that irritates us and drives us crazy holds a lot of potential. And that is a thing that we're really, as a dynamics, we're really interested in. You know, psychologically speaking, you could say, what are some of the things that I'm projecting? Meaning, I see it in another person, but I can't see it in myself.
Right.
And if I can pick up some of that, that will actually enrich in my life and my possibilities, and I will have more fun and more possibilities, a wider range of resources and possibilities, personal resources and personal possibilities, and it will milden my irritation with the other person that I think is doing that to me. So it's about bringing home some of the energies that are a bit more unknown to you. So it's a very personal work, but it's something that people really like doing that, because this is more about personal growth, and we know that developing as a personality or as a person is a very high factor when it comes to employee satisfaction. Whether people stay in an organization or not depends on whether or not they also feel they can develop and grow as a person. So that's some of that. That's where we go there, and it is also one of the reasons why people really burn out, is because people get really irritated with other people and they don't have skills to deal with that, you know. And so it's a bit, you can think of a car mechanic, you know, that works with cars the whole day. At the end of the day, his hands will be full of oil, and he will have to wash his hands to get rid of all the stuff, you know, that he had his hands in during the day. And once he's done that, his hands are clean again. So where is our soap? If we are relating to other people in our work and we're collaborating and we have our hands deep in the human stuff somehow, how can we wash our hands? That's what we're working on there. Yeah.
What would you say to a person that really is curious about whether or not enrolling to that program? That's a difficult one, but...
Well, I would say it depends on what their questions would be. In general, I would ask them maybe, do you like human beings? You know, are you interested in human beings? And if you are, I think you should be doing the program. And if you really don't like human beings that much, maybe it's not going to be so interesting.